You ever notice how history has a way of forgetting the strangest heroes? Not the loud ones, not the medal-wearing, statue-deserving titans who fit neatly into textbooks. I'm talking about the people who don't look like they belong in war at all. The weirdos, the misfits, the artists. The ones who got thrown into chaos not because they were born soldiers, but because the world, like it always does, fell apart, and everyone got drafted into the madness whether they fit the part or not. This is the story about those people. So imagine a dark European countryside in 1944. A moonless night where everything feels like a black and white film. The air smells like diesel, sweat, and the kind of quiet dread that seeps into your clothes. German scouts are listening, careful, trained ears, trying to interpret every echo across the fields. And far off in the distance, they hear something that makes their blood run cold. Tanks. Lots of them. A full armored division by the sound of it. The kind of steel monster that flattens towns. Except here's the thing. There are no actual tanks. Just a bunch of American painters, set designers, and sound engineers. And theater kids cranking a giant speaker, inflating rubber tanks, and painting camouflage on canvas like they're back in art school, but with much higher stakes. This is the Ghost Army. A secret U.S. unit so strange, so improbable, so thoroughly insane, that if you pitched it as a Hollywood script, producers would toss your screenplay in the trash for being unrealistic. Artists? Infiltrating the Nazis with inflatable equipment? Come on. But that's exactly what happened. And their mission wasn't to kill. It wasn't to storm beaches or raise flags or mow through enemy lines. Their mission was to lie convincingly enough to save lives. Fake it, forge it, confuse the enemy. Be so good at deception that the Germans wouldn't know what the hell was real. A little performance art on the grandest stage imaginable. And guess what? It worked. Over and over again. Saving thousands of Allied lives while never firing a shot. This is the story of the Ghost Army of World War II. A story that somehow slipped through the cracks of history, like everything truly strange tends to do. A story that finally gets its due here in this long, winding, reflective trip through a moment where art and war collided in the weirdest way imaginable. But before we get into it, please, like, subscribe, and don't be a poser. World War II wasn't subtle. It wasn't nuanced or forgiving. It was noise and mud and steel and fire. It was a world built on lines, front lines, supply lines, battle lines, drawn with precision and the chaos of men with too much power. And in this machinery of destruction walked a group of young Americans who, in another life, would have been painting murals, designing fashion, composing music, or working in advertising agencies. Instead, they were handed a strange assignment that barely made sense on paper. You're going to pretend to be an entire army. Imagine hearing that at 19 years old. The Ghost Army, officially the 23rd Headquarters Special Troops, was made up of artists from the best art schools in America, illustrators, sound engineers, radio tricksters, set designers, printmakers, sculptors, fashion designers, and at least one person who later became a famous 20th century painter. These were not soldiers in the traditional sense. They didn't look the stereotype. They weren't hulking warriors with square jaws and a 1,000-yard stare. No, they were skinny kids wearing uniforms that didn't quite fit right. Kids who carried pencils in their breast pockets and sketchbooks in their backpacks. Kids who, if this were today, would be working at design firms, tattoo shops, in indie bands, or freelancing out of coffee shops. They were you. They were me. They were every creative outsider who ever felt like they somehow ended up in the wrong movie. But this time being the wrong people was exactly why they were perfect. To understand why the U.S. military suddenly decided to use art school kids as a weapon, you have to understand the desperation of the time. By 1944, the Allies were knee-deep in Europe, pushing the Germans back inch by inch through towns that were barely towns anymore, just rubble with street signs. And the Germans were good at reading troop movements, like scary good. They had experienced scouts, brilliant analysts, and a radar-like instinct for knowing where armies were heading. So the Allies asked a dangerous question. What if we could trick them? What if we could make an entire army appear where it wasn't? And that's where Colonel Billy Harris and Major Ralph Ingersoll came in. They convinced military leadership that deception, real theatrical psychological deception, could save lives. The British had done some of this already with Operation Fortitude, tricking the Germans into expecting the D-Day landing at Calais instead of Normandy. But Harris and Ingersoll wanted something more mobile, more fluid, a traveling circus of illusions. Thus, the Ghost Army was born. Their arsenal included inflatable tanks, rubber artillery, fake airplanes, camouflage nets painted by hand, recordings of troop movements blasted through gigantic speakers, fake radio operators mimicking real battalion chatter, artists painting entire camps that didn't exist, decoys of trucks and jeeps made of plywood. It was art as warfare, a strange, surreal reminder that creativity isn't just a luxury. It can sometimes be a survival mechanism. Their job was simple on paper. Move around Europe, pretending to be different units, keeping the enemy guessing, be loud, be visible, be convincing, but not too close to the front where you'd actually get shot. But nothing about it was simple, because convincing an army, especially a paranoid, cornered Nazi army, took more than props. It took detail, layers, commitment to the bit, if you know what I mean. They would paint insignias of specific divisions on their uniforms. They'd set up fake checkpoints. They'd casually leak false info in bars and cafes where German spies might overhear. They created fake generals with real backstories. They forged entire personas the way some people forge IDs. But their real magic came in the form of sound. It was one of the Ghost Army's greatest assets. Engineers recorded actual armored divisions, tanks, trucks, soldiers marching, equipment rattling. They collected miles of audio tracks on giant industrial recorders that looked like they belonged in a sci-fi flick. Then they blasted these recordings through 500-pound speakers mounted on trucks. These weren't consumer-grade Bluetooth speakers. They were massive rigs capable of projecting fake warfare miles away. You could be sitting in a German outpost, sipping whatever passed for coffee, and suddenly you'd hear a dozen Shermans rolling toward you. Except the Ghost Army sometimes played the recordings in reverse, mixed them, layered them, audio illusions that felt real, but were just wrong enough to warp the enemy's senses. I mean, imagine being a German soldier hearing tanks that never showed up. Imagine preparing for a full-scale attack that doesn't exist. Imagine thinking you're surrounded when you're actually staring at inflatable tanks full of air. Psychological warfare at its weirdest. The visual artists of the Ghost Army were the backbone of the operation. They created what the military called visual deception units. But what they really were, they were art kids with brushes bigger than their forearms trying to make rubber look like steel. They painted shadows onto inflatables. They added fake wear and tear. They'd kick dust around with their boots to make tracks. They'd smear grease in places where grease shouldn't even be, just to look real enough from binocular distance. At some point, you realize this entire unit was a bunch of kids doing one of the most dangerous art installations in history. And if they messed up, if a German scout got close enough to poke an inflatable tank and watch his hands sink in it like a pool toy, game over. They'd all be dead. This wasn't cosplay. This wasn't theater in the park. This was art with consequences. Serious ones. By early 1945, the Ghost Army hit their peak. Operation Viersen, a massive deception designed to trick the Germans into thinking an entire American division was preparing to cross the Rhine River at a completely different location than the real crossing point. The plan was insane. They needed to simulate a giant army, generate sound, create fake vehicle traffic, build entire fake camps, produce phony radio chatter, erect inflatable artillery positions, fool German scouts, and do it all so convincingly that the Germans would move troops away from the real crossing site. And somehow, these art nerds pulled it off. The Germans fell for it hard. They redirected forces, they repositioned artillery, they prepared for a battle that never came. And because of that, thousands of Allied soldiers crossed the Rhine almost unopposed. It may have shortened the war, it definitely saved lives. all from inflatable tanks and theater tricks. I mean, think about that. Think about the absurdity, the beauty, the weird cosmic irony embedded in that moment. The world's deadliest conflict, partially influenced by a traveling band of art school kids. People love tactical stuff, the logistics, the mechanics, but the part that sticks with me, the part that feels like it belongs on this channel, Slack Signal X, is how human it all was. These kids drank cheap wine in French villages. They sketched the locals. They wrote letters home complaining about the mess hall food. Some cried at night. Some questioned why they were there. Some weren't built for war, not even fake war. Some were terrified that their little illusion would get exposed at the worst possible moment. One story goes that German artillery opened fire on one of their inflatable tank positions, and the shells bounced off the rubber hulls, ripping them open like giant balloons. The soldiers ran, ducking for cover, laughing despite themselves because it was so absurd, so ridiculous, so perfectly Ghost Army. Another story tells of a young artist drawing portraits of fellow soldiers between deception missions, some of whom never made it home. Those sketches, raw, charcoal lines, shaky shading, are all that remain of those men. You don't get that in big history books. You get bullet points, dates, names, numbers, victories, losses. But underneath all of it, every war, every empire, every battle, there are always human beings improvising their way through the insanity. And in this case, they improvised with art. Here's the dark joke of history. The stranger your story is, the less likely it survives. After the war, the Ghost Army's mission was classified, top secret, locked away, buried under paperwork and bureaucracy. These kids went home, they went back to art school, some became famous painters, some worked in advertising, some taught, some drank too much, some never spoke about what they did, some carried the guilt of their deceptions, some carried pride, some carried both. But almost no one knew. The US government didn't officially acknowledge the existence of the Ghost Army until 1996, 50 years later. They didn't receive congressional gold medals until 2022. That's 77 years after they saved thousands of lives. You want to talk about forgotten people? That's the blueprint. I'm going to tell you exactly why the Ghost Army matters. Not as trivia, not as a quirky footnote, but as something deeply human. Because the Ghost Army is about more than deception. It's about how absurd war really is. How creativity becomes a weapon when the world collapses. How weirdos often end up saving the day. How the biggest lies are often used to protect lives, not take them. And how the human imagination is both a blessing and a curse. You see, the system is always built on illusions. The real power is always hidden behind the curtains, and nothing is ever what it looks like. You grew up thinking life is straightforward, and then you find out that the Allies used inflatable tanks to trick Nazis. Nothing is simple, nothing is pure, nothing is real in the way we want it to be. History isn't clean, it's makeshift and improvised. It's held together by duct tape and last-minute decisions, and terrified kids pretending they know what they're doing. Just like life. The Ghost Army is gone now. Most of the men who served in it left the world before they ever saw their contribution recognized. Artists who became soldiers, who became ghosts. But their legacy lives on in military deception, Hollywood special effects, psychological operations, camouflage design, audio illusions, visual trickery, and even advertising strategies. What they pioneered in the mud and chaos of World War II is now standard in militaries around the globe. The world saw their weirdness and quietly said, yeah, that works. And to me, the Ghost Army is the ultimate Slack Signal X story because it's not about winning a war. It's about surviving it with creativity and tact. It's about turning art into armor. It's about using imagination as a shield. It's about recognizing that the weird kids, the ones who don't belong, sometimes end up shaping history in ways nobody expects. It's about the idea that the world is a lot stranger, a lot more fragile, and a lot more malleable than we think. And that's the lesson. You don't need to be a hero. You don't need to fit a mold. You don't need statues of your name etched on a memorial. Sometimes all you need is a paintbrush, a sense of mischief, and the willingness to trick a deadly army long enough to save someone else's life. Art as rebellion, art as survival, art as the quiet thing that keeps the world from falling apart. That's the Ghost Army. This has been Slack Signal X.